Okay, check 1, 2, check 1, 2. Gonna get everything rolling here. It is, it's a nice Friday night here in the Rosemary District in Sarasota. Sorry about the background noise. We've got the door open here. My name is Michael Jones. I'm the founder of Create Academy. I'm the creator in residence here at the Sarasota campus here on 5th Street. And this evening, we are just going to talk a little bit about Cinema 4D. Okay, hopefully that noise will go away there. We're going to talk about some of the basics of using cinema. And let's see, let me just get all set up here, and then we'll get rolling. Make sure we're streaming correctly here. Just get all this good stuff. I'm going to go ahead and share this out a couple times. Let's see, and go ahead and share it there as well. Okay. I think we're all set up there. Thank you for your patience. So, as I said, I want to talk about Cinema 4D. I had a great conversation with Lori Burton over at Booker High School. They have an incredible magnet school there. They have a motion design program. They do a lot of After Effects in 2D. But she said students are really, really interested in 3D and in Cinema 4D. And it's just such a great piece of software. It's so user-friendly. It's really built for motion design specifically, although you can do a whole lot of things with it all the way through character animation and stuff like that. So give you a little bit of a look at what we're going to be creating here. I've got the Create Academy logo in this all red monochromatic kind of scene here. And the place that we're going to start is with kind of our base asset here. And so I'm going to jump into Adobe Illustrator. And I've got my Create Academy logo here. Everything's looking okay. I think I actually am going to clean up a little bit of what's going on with these extra points just very quickly. I want to make sure there's no stray points in there that could mess up what we're trying to do when we get into 3D. Now, the one thing we need to know here, because I'm still working with a slightly older version of Cinema 4D, so we're going to go ahead and save this to the desktop. We'll call it CA Logo Splines. We'll go ahead and save that out. And the one thing we got to remember here is to save it as an Illustrator 8 in this legacy format. I believe newer versions of C4D have already updated that, though. So that's step one. We've got our asset. Now let's go into Cinema 4D, and we'll come back to this scene in a minute. We'll talk about some of the texturing and lighting you can kind of see. But first, we just need to go ahead and bring our spline in. So I'm just going to create a new scene, so we're starting fresh here. And I'm going to say File Merge. Just saved it to the desktop here. We'll go ahead and bring this element in. It brings up this dialog where it asks us if we want to connect splines. I'm actually going to uncheck that for now. Let's see how it brings it in. And one thing about doing this is it actually brings in kind of the wider artboard as well. So we're actually going to delete all of that. I'm just going to pull these two splines out. And so this is what we are left with. I can delete, I don't want to delete that. I can delete these null. Come on now. If I take them out of the null object, I can go ahead and bring this right here. So this is a really great place to start if you're totally new to Cinema 4D. A great place to start is working with splines and to build your base forms. The way that I like to kind of bring people in slowly into Cinema 4D is to think about it in kind of a three-step process. The first step being the forms or the geometry, the shapes that exist in the scene. Then on top of that, we have texture, the texture that we apply to that geometry. And then finally, the light and the render engine and the render settings that create the final look. So I actually do need to connect these objects. I just want it to be one piece. And we're going to come in here and we're going to grab this very handy tool called an extrude NURBS, and that is going to give us some depth and some geometry to look at here. So that's good. Now within this extrude NURBS, we've got all kinds of settings that we can work with here. The actual depth of it, or as it says, movement here, and that can go different directions. But for our purposes here, we just kind of want to work with this property here and extrude this depth out so we can get a little bit of geometry in our scene going here. We don't need to go crazy with it. Now the next thing I'm going to focus on is what are known as caps, and that is going to be the edges on this front and back face. That's what it's referring to. So if I choose a fillet cap, that's going to change that geometry there, so hopefully you saw that. If there's no cap versus a fillet cap, it's going to add this little subdivision right here. And then we can go in and actually dial in the radius of that. How big do we want that to be? A little bit further down in our settings here, you can ask it to constrain. So I want it to build a cap, but I don't want it to actually make the geometry larger. And then we get these settings here of the fillet type. So it's by default convex, which just builds it kind of straight across. We could do a half circle, which actually, we need some more steps so we can really see that. So that's the half circle. Concave, so it pulls it inward. And if I actually pull this out and create the radius, that's going to give you a little better look at it. And so that almost has the appearance of it's kind of sketched into stone or something, that kind of look. If we look at half circle, it pulls kind of a circle, one step. That's kind of an interesting one. Or two steps, so now it kind of has a slightly blockier look, or engraved, where it actually pushes the front face of the geometry in and pulls this out. So for my purposes here, I'm actually going to stick with the standard convex, which is just going to round it off. And actually, in my radius, I want to pull this way, way back. I don't want it to be crazy. I actually want the final logo to feel really big, so I need it to feel pretty thin. And then it's just a matter of how many steps we want. So we'll add some geometry there. I'm actually going to pull it all the way back to 1. Actually, let's go ahead and do 2. Now, one thing that I'm noticing that is going to be good to talk about is the angle of the spline that's actually feeding in to our extrude NURBS. So if I actually go ahead and hit render, you'll see that the edge of this is not it's not like perfectly smooth. It almost looks like it's kind of bending, and you can see these little points. And that gets expressed here inside the spline properties. Right now it's saying an angle of 5. So if I actually blow that up even more, you can see it in a more exaggerated form, right? An angle of 30. So instead of it actually distributing between points perfectly, now I have 30-degree angles. If I hit 0, it's going to have to process more data, but that's how we say I don't even want a 5-degree angle. I want that to feel just perfectly rounded, right? So I'm going to go ahead and make that adjustment. So now it's going to look a lot smoother, and especially because the logo here is basically a triangle and a circle. There's a whole lot of real estate on that edge. So I want to make sure that my spline is set to 0 on the angle. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually put a floor into the scene. And I want to actually lay this logo down. A little background noise there. That's the guys from the fire department directly across the street. So I want to lay this down, actually, so I can kind of get some different angles on it and play with it a little bit here. So that's going to be it for geometry so far. So as we said, first question in a scene is geometry. Second question is texture. And I'm going to go in here and choose our Create Academy red, or get pretty close to it. I'm going to turn off specularity, and we'll talk, well, yeah, I'll cover it right now. So specularity is kind of the sheen on the object, right? And you see there's some settings in here, a metallic, and we can play with the width and the height. And that's kind of the hot spot. So like if something is a metallic texture in the real world, you get these little hot spots of where the light almost kind of blows it out. And there's a couple different settings there, but I'm going to turn that off for now because in my original render, I'm just keeping everything really matte. So let's keep everything really simple for now. And I'm going to apply this to both, kind of like I was doing before, keeping everything really monochromatic and simple in the scene here. And if I hit render, we'll go ahead and see that we're not getting enough information. It's not looking good enough yet. Excuse me. So we need to add some light into the scene, as we said, is kind of our next step. And I'm just going to grab an area light and go ahead and pull this up. And I'm going to pull it over. I want to do a really simple kind of directional lighting setup here. And we need to adjust kind of some of the details of the light here. So if I go into the Details tab on the light, it has this whole section called Fall Off. And I tend to choose this inverse square, physically accurate fall off because I like what that gives me. And so I'm going to actually rotate this down so I'm not seeing the edge of the area light. And this actually gives me then this user interface device here where I can change the fall off of this light, to be larger or much smaller. So I'm just going to put that right there for now. And in here, I'm going to go back to General. And so if I actually hit Render again, you're going to see we still don't see any shadows. It just still looks like it's floating. We can't see exactly where the logo ends and the floor begins. And one part of that is just a lack of shadows being pushed from the light. And that's as simple as, let's choose soft shadows and see what that gives us. So that gives us a really soft shadow that kind of gradiates out at the edge. And that's a good opportunity then to, let's say we wanted really long shadows or longer shadows, we could push that light further in that direction. Let's go ahead and keep it pretty close. Ray traced or hard shadows. That's going to be very similar, except that edge isn't, it's not gradiating out, it just stays hard. And then area shadows are a kind of mix between the two. They're a little bit of a mix of soft shadow and the hard shadow. And actually within the shadows, we can also dial in the density. So if we take that down to like 10%, let's say, you can see it there very, very faintly. Let's take it to 50%. So you can see there. Let's actually take it to 100%, but play with the color a little bit, right? So we could actually color our shadows that the light is pushing. So I'm choosing kind of a burgundy. We could get really wonky with it and choose kind of a lighter color. That's not showing up as well. Let's just go ahead and keep it black for now. Now, these lights can perform different functions, right? There's this one box in here called ambient illumination that is not checked. If I go ahead and check it, it really changes the nature of what this light is giving us. So let's go ahead and render that. You can see it changes it in the scene, but what that is doing is setting it up to work with the global illumination kind of render engine here. And global illumination is the idea that the light in the scene will bounce. And so this very first value right here, called diffuse depth, that is the number of times we want it to bounce. So if we leave it at 1, the light will bounce once. If we go to 2, so on and so forth. And I'm going to turn down a lot of these settings to a lower quality just so we can take a look. And it's going to take it a little bit longer to calculate. But just that little tweak, using global illumination versus the standard render engine, it actually is going to give you these moments in here. So let me actually get a lot closer. This is going to take just a second more. So because we're bouncing light, if you see the interior of that top area, that kind of top half circle, if we weren't using global illumination, we wouldn't see any of that detail in there. But because the light is bouncing one time, we can kind of get this, effect going here. And the next thing to look at, I think, would be what's known as ambient occlusion. And ambient occlusion, let's actually turn off global illumination. Let's go backwards, and let's actually turn off our shadows and talk a little bit about ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is the shadow between objects when they're close together, right? And that's trying to simulate more of what happens in the real world, which is this little contact shadow. I'm actually going to turn off ambient illumination for a second, and that's actually not going to show it as well. So I'm going to go back to ambient illumination. So ambient occlusion is this line right here in the middle, right? It's where these things are touching, and it creates that little contact shadow. And within the ambient occlusion, we get a lot of the same settings, right? We can talk about the accuracy, the number of samples, which is kind of the number of times it's calculating. And then we can change the color. If we didn't want it to be really black, we could take it closer to gray. We could try to work with different colors. Do something crazy with like a blue ambient occlusion. And it's going to be very faint because it's kind of a detail that gets factored into the scene. And if I take it to white, it almost disappears. But for our purposes now, I'm just going to kind of dial it into like a gray type of region there. And that's going to give us that nice little contact shadow. But I'm going to turn global illumination back on for now. I'm going to leave ambient occlusion on, so we'll now get the combination of these two things, right? A bouncing light, that's going to add more light to the scene and more dimension, and then that ambient occlusion, which adds that contact shadow. And then if we come back into our light and say, I want to come back to those area shadows, now it's going to calculate all of those, and you see the area shadow is coming in really, really dark because I just have a single light in the scene. And I actually kind of want to pull back on that pretty heavily. That's what I was doing in my previous scene. Okay, and that's a little wonky. You can see when I change the color of the shadow to red, it actually emits a red shadow, which I think is definitely a cool opportunity to do some more stylized type 3D stuff. But for now, I'm just going to pull it to more of a mid-tone gray and see what that is giving me. It's pulling out kind of a nice, soft little shadow. I think that's okay. The next thing we could do here in this scene is actually add a camera. And this is why studying some basics of photography, even before going into a program like Cinema 4D, if you're going to do character animation, if you're going to do 3D motion graphics, Photography camera basics are really good because these digital cameras are touching on concepts that you learn with an actual physical camera, you know, in terms of focal length, sensor size, and things like that. So, you know, the wider the angle, the more it's going to distort the image. So if I actually create like a 15 millimeter, which would almost be like a fisheye lens, not quite, but close to a fisheye lens, with just a really, really wide angle. And because I have ambient illumination, I want to change my display settings. So here in the display settings, you can ask for various ways to view the scene while you're working in it. Gorod shading is the default, but you can ask it to add lines. Give me the geometric lines so I can kind of see what I'm doing. So here in this fish angle lens, you can see we're getting a lot of distortion, like if I pull in really close to this angle. But a wide angle lens also makes the object feel really big. And so this is kind of a principle of digital photography. If I wanted this scene and this logo to feel really small, I could choose something more like a portrait lens, like an 80 millimeter, that's going to zoom in more on the image. It's going to flatten out the image. We're not going to get that distortion at the edge. And so now it would feel, and if I kind of just frame this up a little bit, it's going to feel smaller, right? Because if you're standing at the base of a skyscraper, there actually is a kind of distortion from your perspective because our eyes are actually very close to wide-angle lenses. So if I go back to a 15 millimeter, I can really get down low in here, and this logo could start to feel kind of almost like a skyscraper, right? And so that is something to think about when we're putting a camera into the scene of, you know, what do we need it to feel like? Does it need to feel big and epic and like it's towering over us? Or does it need to feel small, like we're kind of looking down or shooting down on something? So that is kind of some of the basics of thinking about what's going on with your camera there. Sensor size, I tend not to mess with as much, but there's certainly a lot to talk about there as well. And then also just the notion of white balancing the camera, which is probably not something you need to mess with quite a bit. So by default, the camera comes in white balance to daylight. But if you were shooting, you know, let's say we created an environment more like a photo studio with more luminescent or kind of fluorescent lighting, then we could choose to change these settings here. So let's just see if we can dial in a couple different angles that we think are interesting here and look at some of our rendering. I'll stick with this 15 millimeter for now. Let's let this calculate for a second. So my shadows are looking a little funny. So a couple things going on, right? We first dialed in our fillet cap, which is this hard edge. And so you can imagine if you went back now into the extrude NURB and changed that, we could really change the look of this object. You know, because I'm using an area light with a fall off, I get this really pretty fall off where there's this hot spot, this, you know, very bright hot spot in the scene up on the top left corner, and it just kind of fades off, gradiates off. And so let's actually change our cap style to engraved, and let's see the aesthetic we get there, maybe pulling that edge out a little more. So it's actually a really good example. It's a nice angle to kind of examine what these different cap styles do. Engraved, two-step. And then we can come back to the radius, right? Like if we were to pull this radius way in, and look at that, it's kind of breaking our geometry a little bit. We could maybe get something that feels a little more stacked. And we're getting some problems with our geometry there. And that's going to be a function of us trying to constrain the geometry in place. We actually probably just need to let it expand. And so let's calculate that out again. So there you go, the two-step. It's got that kind of vibe. You know, one step. Let's take just a quick peek at the half circle and see what kind of aesthetic that's going to give us. Yeah, very similar to the engraved, except it's a little more rounded on some of the edges there. So that's some of the basics, right? We started in Illustrator, we had our geometry, and then we bring that in, we can extrude it out and you know, work with our texturing. And if we were to come back into our texture, so much we can do, right? The very first thing we talked about was specularity. And let's see. Let's do specularity. Let's add a metallic specularity and see what that gives us. So it's going to look more dull right off the bat, and we probably need a lot. We'd need a lot more light in the scene to really take advantage of a more metallic texture. And so even in my light setting, let me go up and turn that intensity up and see what happens there. So I don't think we have enough in the scene to really get a full appreciation of what it's doing there. The next thing we could do is apply a reflection channel to our texture. And so you see, so now here in the preview window, it looks like chrome. And we're going to mess with that in a second. I'm not loving the half circle here. I just want to go back to the convex base and take that. We can let it be a little bigger. So in the reflection channel, because the brightness is set at 100, it's saying that the reflection value should be 100%, so that's like chrome. As we pull that back, now it looks a little more like a kind of a glossy car, or we pull it even back and it gets a little more faint, so it's almost like a more faded metal, and we continue to dial that in, and it starts to pull back. We could change the blurriness, right? We could say 20%, so now it's, you know, there's more of a grit to that texture where it's taking the reflection, but it's dispersing it and kind of blurring it up, which is actually really slow to calculate. Typically, I'm going to pull that back. But the thing about reflection, if I just go ahead and run it, is we're going to have to put, we're going to have to put other stuff in the scene for it to reflect. The only reflection we would probably see is on the ground plane, and you can see it very faintly in there. And let's just exaggerate it so we can try to get a better look at what we're doing here. So you see now that I have the same texture applied to the logo and the floor plane, it's just reflecting into the floor. So it's actually a really good look at it. And let's blur it to like 30%. Let's really blur that and see. And it might be so subtle that it's actually a little hard to see there. So, and you can kind of see it in this top half circle here of just that blurred reflection there. And I'm going to pull that way back, and I'm going to mix it. Well, let's not even get into that just yet. We'll go ahead and pull this back. Now, the typical way to go about, you know, creating more in the scene to reflect is to add an image to a sphere, right? Add a kind of a mapped image to a sphere. Let's see if I can actually very quickly just grab like a sky here. Let's see. Actually, I don't want a sky. I actually want an HDRI map. Where are you at, HDRI map? Yeah, these maps here. So let's actually pull this guy in here. And I'm going to apply this image to the sky layer. And now we're going to get a heck of a lot of reflection going in the scene. Because now there is an actual image, right, that's kind of like encompassing the world, and it has something to pull from, right? So you can see our blurriness doing its work there. You can see now that we have that image there, you know, it's like an image of a room, an interior of a room that's mapped into a spherical format. And so it has information. It's as though now that, you know, our scene is sitting in that room, and if we have a reflection property in our texture, then it has all this information. You can also see our specularity of how it's getting blown out, how the white hot spots in the room, you know, are taking like this left edge here, just actually blowing that out all the way to white, and we're getting it in a couple places there. So that's actually a much clearer example now of what we can do. Let's really give the computer something to think about here. So we're taking that blurriness up, and you can see, oh, yeah, that's not going to look good. And there's something in that image, whether they had a light in the room when they shot that image, or it's just the sun coming through, that's creating this crazy white hotspot in the scene. A couple ways we could go about addressing that. We could rotate the image, see if we could move that off slightly. We could look at using a different image. We could change the specularity. We could change some of the reflection. Let's take this way back to 10%. I'm going to mix it with a Fresnel. I'm going to take it to 50%. Then I'm going to grab my sky object. I'm just going to rotate it a little bit and see if I can catch this camera angle at a slightly different look. And so we'll move that white hotspot off. The biggest thing out of that HDRI map appears to be just like a panel of windows that are bringing some warmer light into the scene here. And the thing, you know, working with various maps, they're like very easy to find, very easy to pull in. And so it's a really good way if you need something reflective like this. And so I think if we were putting together storyboards or needing to put together some style frames, I would probably look at, you know, shooting this from different angles, trying to see it. You know, I think there was a really nice package. I don't know if it was a broadcast package for FX, where the scene was very similar to this. The camera was at like this low angle, and the camera would kind of just pull through and around these various, you know, almost walls like this. Oh boy, let's get back in there. And you know, it would depend on what our end goal is. I think it was FX, where they were doing some really interesting things with light and some wide-angle camera lenses. So we're just zoomed in on one piece of it here. We see our blurry, reflective material. That side's getting a crazy amount of reflection. So I think we're going to abandon this scene for now. Let me make sure. I'm just going to check here, see if anybody had any questions. Donald Moore. All right, yeah, we've got a few questions here. What are you drinking? This is LaCroix. This is orange-flavored LaCroix, which I still don't love, but it's growing on me. Donald Moore, wow, blast from the past. How you doing, man? Let's see, yeah, we're pushing this through MoGraph Mentor, but we're on the Create Academy page. Let me pull this back here. Let's go ahead and abandon this scene. I'm going to hit Command-N to bring in a new scene. And I want to talk now about some of the like procedural animation tools that we can work with here. And I'm going to start by coming into my splines panel and grabbing this lovely helix spline. And I want it to be nice and tall, because this is actually going to be a path that I want to move geometry along, right? We're going to animate along this spline. So I actually want the height to be pretty big. And I might even want to pull that up just a little bit more. Let's do something in that realm. So the next thing I'm going to do is grab a spline wrap, which is a deformer. So this panel is, all of these are known as deformers. And if you see, there's like a bend deformer, a twist deformer. These are procedural ways of, making adjustments to geometry in the scene. So I actually need to, goes the fire department yet again. I'm going to need some geometry in the scene that I can actually put on this spline and make it kind of move along in a path. And I am going to use a cube. And we're definitely going to have to make some adjustments, but I almost want it to feel a little bit like a ribbon type animation. So I'm going to make it decently thin. I'm going to add a couple segments in the middle, and I'm not going to go crazy yet, but we are going to need to talk about using segments. And I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. So my memory needs to serve me. We'll say, so you got to select your spline wrap. And within the spline wrap, the big piece of information it needs is to say, OK, what is the spline that's going to guide what we're going to deform the geometry to? And so I'm going to just drag the helix layer directly into that slot on spline. And then I'm going to make it a child of the cube. And so now that it's a child of this cube, you see it's it's breaking it up. It looks wonky. It's doing some crazy stuff. And the very first setting we need to look at is called the mode of the spline wrap. And right now it's saying fit to spline. So it's trying to take whatever geometry it is a child of, and it's trying to fit it across the entire spline. And that's not what we want. We want it to actually keep its length. So we'll say keep length. The next thing we're going to notice, and then I'm going to come into this offset actually, and you can see that it's starting to work, right, how it's traveling along, but it's not pointing the right direction. So what I need to do is work with, and it's just usually trial and error, so we'll say, yeah, plus Z. So now it's actually laying down on that spline in a way that is useful, so we can make this fly around the scene a little bit. And so if you see let me actually just back up here, sorry. I know it might be a little tough to see. So with this one offset value, now I can make this fly around. And let me just create a really bright, just pure white texture. Come on, don't go on the spline. And again, I want to see my lines and my shading there. Actually, I just want to pull all this up out of the floor. So all the action to actually animate this happens within the spline wrap settings here and just on offset. Now I can make it travel along this path, and you see it deforming. Now, it looks a little blocky, and the way that we want to clean that up is by adding more geometric segments here. So if I come in here and start adding more segments, and can't see it because of my texture. If I add more segments, you're going to see it smooth out, right? So if we get in here. So now it's starting to look really, really smooth. We could even add more segments in the X axis. We could add some segments to the side. So like, for example, if I only had 5 segments in the Z axis, you would see there's only 5 pieces of divided geometry for it to bend. But if like we just had it at 66 there, now there's enough divisions for it to kind of lay down flat on that spline. And like we were talking about before, splines by default come with this 5-degree angle. I just want to take that to 0. I want it to be a perfectly distributed spline. I don't want it to break into any pieces there. So let's lay a couple keyframes. We'll bring it back to 0. So now it's at its starting point. Actually, I'll even go to -9. I'm going to lay a keyframe, and I'm at 0 here in my timeline. Let's go forward to 90 frames, which would be 3 seconds if we're working at 30 frames per second. And then we'll just go to the very end of that. And then we'll Control-click on the offset to create another keyframe. So now we've got some animation brewing here. I can put my texture back on, my cube layer. And let me pull my camera angle, more in line, because we probably wouldn't want to see the end of it. So this is the spline wrap deformer. It's just incredibly useful. You can take a cube, you could take a sphere, you could take any piece of geometry, and as long as it has enough subdivisions, you could get it to stretch across any spline, right? I'm using a helix here, but we could create our own path that we need it to go down. The next thing I'll do is I'm just going to actually hit Alt-G to group these, and we'll call it shape 1. And then I'm just going to Control drag out a copy. And then in that copy, I'm going to grab the helix, and then I'm going to rotate. Let's rotate it a good bit, actually. Oops. I'm going to rotate it so it kind of leaves the frame in that direction. And so if we let it play through, you can see just how quickly we would start to get something interesting, right? If I just needed a couple elements to be rotating and spinning towards the screen, these kind of ribbon elements, building out the first spline wrap and getting everything set up, then you've got an element that can be duplicated. And simply rotating that helix, now I get something that's a little more interesting. And then we could go into all kinds of interesting offset. And so just because these are pure white, we're not going to see any dimensionality to them. They're just going to look like flat objects, which oftentimes is really useful too, right? Let's say you're doing like a 2D animated piece, and you need this kind of ribbon animation, but you don't want it to look 3D, you just want it to look 2D. You can just create a matte texture that would allow you to, so let's get like a better angle. So like that's kind of a nice moment, right? It would look completely like 2D animation. And if we actually pull this back and just add a color, add a light to the scene. Let me actually go into my top-down view and pull this light forward. We could certainly make it look 3D if we needed to. And those guys. And the great thing about this setup, actually, is that these cubes are still what is known as parametric, meaning they're still live. Like I can change the settings. So if it's too thin and it's like, actually, we want those to be way blockier because we do want it to feel more 3D, well, it's still a live object, right? I'm not locked in. I can just pull these out. And now it's very clearly a 3D element, right? So that's the look we're going to get there. Let me come back to Facebook, see if there's any questions. Would you suggest using Cinema 4D over something like Autodesk, Maya, or Blender? Yeah, Donald, I absolutely would recommend Cinema 4D over those other ones. Blender's great because it's free. Maya now might also be free in terms of like if you download it as a student. Cinema 4D is really good about giving out student licenses. That's why we've used it in MoGraph Mentor for years. Cinema 4D is regarded as the most motion graphics appropriate 3D application. And the spline wrap is a good example of a tool that's kind of built for motion designers. Autodesk Maya is probably the most robust of the group. You could make, at Disney they're using Maya. You can make an entire animated feature film in a program like Maya. Cinema 4D can basically do all those same things, but it just has a tool set that makes it really user-friendly for motion designers. So let's actually create a new scene and talk a little bit about some procedural type animation. I'm going to create some segments. Flies coming in here. So there's actually this tab here that says MoGraph, and I'm actually going to pull this guy out. MoGraph and effectors, right? So this is the reason Cinema 4D gets talked about so much for motion design, is this whole tool set right here. A cloner object is a really fantastic tool, right? So I could put my geometry into a clone, and I get all this really interesting options of what I can do here. So if I pull this out, right? So now I have a procedural way of building these clones. So I have this object, and then I also have a tab for effectors, right? So if I grab a random effector, and oops, just need to push it one time. Now it's going to change the position of these in a totally random way. So let's say I just dial that up a bit, right? So now I'm, really, really quickly getting a result that's useful for certain things. So let's actually pull back out of that. Let's not talk about the cloner just yet. Let's actually, what do I want to do here? I actually want to just make it a child, come into the random effector, and do point deformation. Come back here, let's say 20. Need that to go way down. Let's say 10. So what I'm doing now is actually using a random effector to affect the points of geometry on this object. I'd like to see it with lines. Let's actually see my points here. And by points, we just mean where all of these intersections meet. That's considered a point. So within the random effector, there's this deformer panel. And then actually in the effector, I can add an animation, right? So a noise pass, right? So I can actually create some procedural animation. Noise is just the idea of randomness, right? And if I'd actually want to scale that down. So now I'm having that random effector, right, with just two things in the scene. Pulling the points of geometry on this platonic, on this object, and pushing it and pulling it and undulating and adding a noise pass to what we're trying to do, right? If we could take this to a more extreme place here in the parameters, like, I really want you to pull those X points, right? Take everything in the X-axis, a maximum of 127 centimeters is what it's saying. If we take that back to 10, right, we could say, what about the Y-axis? What about the up-down? And then, of course, we could just go absolutely nuts, pull everything in every direction, and then actually try to create a more visually interesting look by using an atom array. Let's drop it. Nope, not a connect. An atom array is a really interesting little tool where the atom array creates geometry out of the points and out of the tangents on the geometry, right? And if I go into this atom array and I drop this down to be much thinner, now I'm getting something procedural and interesting. And let's actually, I want the spheres to stand out a little. Can I take this to 0.5? So let's go ahead and hit render real quick. And of course, this is a bit of random nonsense, but it just shows you just how quickly, we could get something going. So it's the transform properties on the random effector that's causing this thing to go so nuts, and we could pull that back on each axis and do kind of this number. But there's just so many great tools in here that allow you to quickly create something with visual interest, create various elements, and then obviously just having 3 dimensions to play in is incredibly useful. So let's see, any questions? Maya is basically free now. Yeah, Maya is basically free unless you're using it for commercial purposes. Yeah, sort of like creating particles. Yeah, that's right. And you know, the cloner is really useful for that. Let's see, anything else we should talk about on this one? And we're going to continue to do more of these live streams here as we've got the campus going now. But yeah, highly recommend Cinema 4D. Let's see. And the atom array is like definitely something I've found a lot of use for. But it doesn't have to be a platonic, right? We could take a, we could just take a sphere and go ahead and replace the platonic with a sphere. And the sphere beats up a little better. So let's see if we can't take these more. And then the actual number of segments, because the atom array is just grabbing, it's grabbing the tangents and it's grabbing the points. So we could get way down here, right? So now we could just get something kind of geometric. You know, we could go back into the effector and say animation speed. Let's take it to 1/10 of what it is. Right, now it's this kind of like living sculpture, moving lines type of visual. And we could, you could make the points larger in the atom array, and that gets controlled. That gets controlled here. So we could take that up. So you could get this kind of push and pull look happening. Take that back down. 0.1 on the cylinder, I believe, is as thin as we could go. And then we could get something in this look. I've definitely used this tool set specifically for like concert graphics, like you know, big screen stuff where you just need an element. And Cinema 4D is not really a finishing software. It's kind of for building elements and then going into After Effects to finish out various looks and using these elements. So I think we're going to kill the broadcast right there. So let's see, Donald says, that was sort of like particles with the cloner randomization. That is a lot easier to do in Cinema. Yeah, I think it just comes down to that tool set of like Cinema 4D is giving us these cheats to quickly create this stuff. Although, you know, it sounds like Houdini now is building out a really specific tool set for motion graphics, and Blender and Maya may do really similar things, just because now motion design is becoming so much more common. So that's some basics. I wanted to keep it under an hour here. I think next time we do this, we're going to look at some After Effects, some 2D text animation stuff that I've been working on recently. And thanks to everybody who hung out. This recording is going to be up to be seen later. Well, good stuff, Donald. I'm glad we could connect on here, bud, and that you're getting into motion design. That's really cool. So until next time, I'm Michael Jones here at Create Academy. If you're in Sarasota and you happen to be seeing this, you know, come on by the campus here. We're at 1421 5th Street. We've got lots of free events coming up. The campus is officially open July 1, where we're going to start offering seats. The idea here is really simple. This is a portfolio school. You come here to really affordably and flexibly build your portfolio, whether that's going to be in illustration, whether that's going to be in motion design, filmmaking. And we're also interested in working with character animators and young entrepreneurs as well. So if you're in Sarasota and you want to come out, just 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, come say hello and check out the website at createacademy.io. Thanks, everybody.